the ninth and final lecture in Sealaska Heritage Institute's series entitled, We Have Lived in Southeast Alaska Since Time Immemorial. I'm Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. The title of today's lecture is Interactions and Relations Among Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian Societies. As you watch the lecture, we invite you to submit questions in the chat box in YouTube. Dr. Langdon has graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of his presentation. Dr. Steve Langdon is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, where he taught for 38 years. Dr. Langdon has conducted research projects on many public policy issues impacting Alaska Natives over his 45-year career. He has advocated for policies that enhance and promote rural Alaska Native communities and their cultures in such fields as fisheries, lands, tribal government, cultural heritage, customary trade, and co-management. Dr. Langdon has specialized in research on the history and culture of the Tlingit and Haida peoples of Southeast Alaska from pre-contact conditions through the historic period of the 19th and early 20th century U.S. governance. He has conducted extensive research on traditional ecological knowledge and uses of salmon by the Tlingit and Haida, demonstrating the complex and rich relations between the people and salmon that sustain their cultures for centuries. His book, The Native People of Alaska, is a widely used introduction to Alaska Native people. Dr. Langdon delivered the keynote address to the 100th convention of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and he has received the Bullock Prize from the University of Alaska Foundation and the Denali Award from the Alaska Federation of Natives for his contributions to Alaska Native life. Dr. Langdon.
Well, thank you very much, Chuck, for that very gracious introduction. I'm waiting here to be able to turn on the presentation. I was honored to be invited to present in this very, very prestigious series. It's the presenters that have gone before. I'm not seeing, now I see my share screen, so I will proceed. I'd like to thank all of the participants who have come today to listen to the presentation. At the outset, I would note that I will be using primarily, I will be using anglicized spellings, but recognize that the orthographies for each of these societies and their terms they differ significantly. So I want to make that point at the outset. My topic today is to discuss the nature of the interactions and the relations amongst the Haida, Tlingit, and Tsimshian societies that make up the residents of southeastern Alaska. This is an indication of the region called the Northwest Coast Culture Area, in which there are underlying defining cultural traits that include a maritime or riverine orientation. Salmon is a major subsistence resource, woodworking for communal houses, corporate descent groups with matrilineal descent, stratification systems with elites, commoners, and slaves, highly developed property rights, potlatch ceremonialism, and distinctive art styles and objects. Included in these defining cultural traits are the recognition of salmon and other living organisms as people with spiritual essences similar to those of human beings. The chart indicates the basic location of what is called the northern interaction sphere by archaeologists, and also the northern northwest coast culture area. This particular chart shows the location of the Tsimshian groups, particularly the Coast Tsimshian in particular. At the time of contact, it's difficult to estimate, but the populations have been suggested that the Haida of Haida Gwaii in Southeast Alaska enumerated 12 to 15,000 people, the Tlingit 15 to 20,000, and the Coast and Southern Tsimshian between 10 and 12,000. One of the points that I'd like to make here in quickly in comparison is the comparison of the overall geographic reach of each of these societies. The Tlingit reach is far more expansive in terms of the territory covered, while Coast Tsimshian society is highly concentrated on the Skeena River, the mouth and the islands opposite it, and the mouth of the Nishka River. So something to bear in mind in terms of spatial densities of populations and relationships going forward. So in my presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the languages, which you've already covered individually, but for those who weren't participants in that other lectures, just briefly touch on that. Some oral traditions of origin, the archaeological evidence from the regions, underlying social structures, ceremonial practices, cosmological and spiritual beliefs, and cultural accounts of trade, conflict, population movements, and other influences. We'll also discuss what I call the spiritualized primagnics, that underlying beliefs in the efficacy of shamanic behavior and shamanic burials. Then we'll briefly touch on the post-contact situation of relationships up to 1900. Now, as is aware, Kadas or Haida is considered a linguistic isolate. However, it has internally 4 dialectical forms that are recognized. Tlingit is considered to be deeply related to the Dodene languages of the interior. Separation estimates of about 6,000 years ago as the populations moved from the interior down to the coast, where integration ensued. The Tsimshian languages are considered to be of the Penutian language family. It is a distinct term. It is a linguistic term that covers 3 distinct ethnic language groups in northern British Columbia. Smalgyak is the linguistic name for the Coast and Southern Tsimshian languages, Nishka for the people of the Nass River, and Gitskan for the people of the upper Skeena River above Kitsalas Canyon. Those are distinct languages. Other Penutian languages are found primarily in Oregon and California far to the south. So this is a really underlying significant feature, and I think discussed elsewhere is the nature of how these languages have implicated through loan words and other kinds of linguistic features, the patterning of speech in each other's language. In terms of the oral traditions of origins, the Kadas oral traditions do not speak of migration to their current lands. There is an origin story instead of Raven's discovery and freeing of people on the island, and this is this on Rose Spit at the northeastern corner of the islands, and this is the famous Haida carver and sculptor Bill Reed's replication of Raven's freeing of the Haida people from the giant clamshell. Tlingit origins are located in clan traditions that recount movements to the coast and subsequent establishment of their villages. Some traditions speak of moving down the Nass and Skeena rivers and then traveling north to southeastern Alaska. Other traditions come from other river corridors down to the coast, and also in the far north, Yakutat groups traveled across the ice fields to reach the coast and become part of the Tlingit society in the Yakutat region. Co-Tsimshian origin traditions place them at the headwaters of the Stikine River, then traveling across land to the upper reaches of the Skeena River, where their ancestral home, Temlahem, was destroyed by a flood. They were then forced to move downriver to the coast by a massive slide that destroyed their villages. Archaeological evidence is comparatively limited in all three regions when we look at the archaeological records from, say, the southwestern part of the United States. The rainforest environment is a relatively strong factor in how sites of previous occupancy are difficult to find. Another important variable in this region is that changing sea levels from 14,000 to 6,000 years ago as seas first rose and then receded as a result of tectonic and isotonic activities affected different areas in various different ways. Consequently, we can't make confident comparisons in terms of timing because of these considerations. The earliest evidence of occupation at present is approximately 10,000 years ago in the Icy Strait and Chatham Strait region. The earliest evidence of occupation in Haida is below current level on the east coast of Graham Island at approximately 11,000 years ago. And the earliest evidence of occupation in the Tsimshian region derives from the Skeena River and the nearby coast. No sites in those areas as yet have been discovered that precedes 5,000 years in date. Archaeological evidence indicates that the area occupied by the three groups constituted an interaction sphere where shared artifact types and materials are found being distributed from various locations as early as 8,000 years ago. Trade of obsidian from sources in southeastern Alaska are found in both Tsimshian and Haida sites. Copper was another material that moved from locations in the Atna region to the north and by long distances of maritime trade. So there's underlying then an archaeological substrate of a demonstration of a deep similarity in material culture, likely arising out of interaction, but not necessarily indicating any distinctions amongst the regional populations. Environmental factors appear to have contributed to increased salmon and shellfish abundance beginning around 6,000 years ago. And this in turn led to a shift in a more generalized subsistence orientation to multiple resources, to a greater degree of emphasis upon salmon. This is accompanied by both the ability to process salmon so that the abundances that occur in the summer runs can be stored and consumed later in the year, and also used as foods for feasting and ceremonial events. Consequently, we begin to see a takeoff in cultural development, and this appears the signature of the early village structures associated with winter village style permanent houses, somewhat smaller in design initially, first appear in Tsimshian territory around 4,000 years ago, both on the Skeena River and on the coast near the mouth of the Skeena River as well. The same patterning begins in southeastern Alaska around 3,500 years ago, and then in Haida somewhat later do we find this kind of winter village and seasonal camp orientation at about 2,500 years ago. The archaeological record indicates evidence of continuing exchanges of materials which implicate ongoing trade and exchange between the groups over these time periods of cultural development. This is a reconstruction of the Palmasan site, which is located on the Skeena River at about 3,500 years ago. It's a quite fascinating reproduction from very intensive excavations and archaeological work. Quite interesting to note the roof structures, the smoke holes, the plank, the entrances, but also equally significant, if not more so, is the use of the palisade. The palisade is an indicator of the necessity for some forms of defense vis-a-vis relationships with potential enemies that might. This location is at a highly productive salmon site, and so would have been extremely valued and continues to be so to this day. So let's take an overview now of what the basic organization and spatial distribution of the groups are. Amongst the Tlingit and Haida in southeastern Alaska, we have what would be termed sociogeographic divisions, which in the Tlingit language are termed kwans. These can be seen on these mapped through the dotted lines. Inside a kwan, several clans, usually on either side, have their villages and engage in peaceful relationships. Whereas outside of the kwan, there is the potential for conflicts of various different kind. Over time, those units have shifted from about 13 to 15 through joining and such kinds of relationships. These societies are divided linguistically into a northern and southern society, some slight kinds of cultural patterning differences as well. Amongst the Haidas, there are generally thought of as 4 divisions that are linguistic: southern, central, northern, and then in Alaska, the Kaigani distinction. There is fairly substantial distance between the dialectical forms of the northern, which is close to Kaigani, and the southern. The northern one is close to the Alaskan version, while the southern one, called the Skidegate, is somewhat different. Here we can see on the left are the divisions of the various different Haida locations, and on the right, those are a mapping of the village locations that indicate where the Haida winter villages were located at the time of contact. For the Tsimshian as a term, as we noted before, references 4 different ethnic categories and 3 languages. Here you can see this labeled as Ko-Tsimshian. Their approximate locations in the islands offshore near the present-day community of Prince Rupert, and then up the Skeena River to the Kitsalas Canyon. Above them are the Gitskan. The image on the right shows the territorial configurations of the 9 tribes of the Ko-Tsimshian. And they can considered to be in a loose alliance in terms of their relationships. This represents their summer orientation, as they have all moved from their winter villages in Prince Rupert Harbor up into their territories to harvest and process salmon, which will then be transported back down to the mouth of the river for winter utilization. In Prince Rupert Harbor, we find an archaeological configuration of sites that go back 5,000 years. And this is considered a flagship group of sites because they provide significant insights about cultural development, continuous occupation over that 5,000-year period, evidences of changes in subsistence, and interestingly, but not absolutely predictable, is that those sites, to a certain degree, correspond to the winter village locations of the 9 distinct tribes that comprise the Ko-Tsimshian as a society. These are depicted here on this particular image in terms of where their villages were located at contact and over time in the Prince Rupert Harbor area. Let's turn now to a discussion of the descent principles, a primary principle of social organization by which human beings organize themselves into units. Descent refers basically to the principle that children are born. And so that is the way societies reproduce, and that is a fundamental principle that we call how kinship relationships are defined. All 3 societies utilize as a primary rule of descent a unilineal matrilineal descent. Primary identity is established by the social position of the mother, and the mother's descent then, in terms of the social unit she is a member of, is passed on to her children. Fathers and grandfathers groups are not excluded, but they fall into a different form of relationship in each of the societies. All three societies practice exogamy. Exogamy means that a person must marry outside their own social unit. In the Tlingit circumstance, that's they cannot marry in their own clan, and they must marry, in fact, a member of an opposite clan. And we'll look at the principle of opposites here momentarily. In many cases, a pattern of continuing marriage between two social units persists over generations through some form of a preference for what is called cross-cousin marriage. Due to time constraints, I won't be able to go into that very sophisticated principle and practice in terms of how it is accomplished, but it occurs in all three social societies that in turn leads to a pattern of marriage between two social units over significant generational periods. So the descent principle in and of itself does not establish a group. Descent groups go far beyond kin relationships that kin terms establish. Among the Tlingit, the reference is to the clan as the primary corporate unit. However, there are also the subunit referred to as the house, which is also a primary form of an individual's identity. In communities, there may be multiple clan houses that are ranked. This may be a more, where they have clans from different sides, this may be a more recent pattern. Tlingits also have what is referred to as a moiety division. That means the society divides itself into two sides. And the clans, all the clans are positioned either in one side as ravens or in the other side of eagle wolf. Hence, the opposites in this case about marriage means that ravens must marry members of eagle and wolf clans, whereas eagle and wolf clan individuals must marry persons from the raven clan. The Haida used the lineage as the oral traditional unit of membership, and the lineage takes a new name upon its migration and reestablishment. It retains an oral tradition of its ancestry and its linkages, but becomes a differently named social unit. This is not the way in which Tlingits generally do that, but there are some cases in which clans are both continuous and clans break off and have new names. The Haidas also use the house as a part of the matrilineal unit of descent membership. The Haida divide the lineages into raven and eagle moieties. The Tsimshian matrilineal descent units are organized at 4 levels. What is referred to as a sib is somewhat similar to the clan and the lineage. Then within the sib there are houses. And then unlike the double grouping in the Tlingit and Haida, the Tsimshians have a 4-part phratry grouping. And those 4 parts are in term joined. These are identified, as with the Tlingit and Haida, by totemic crests of animals. These principles are in turn aligned across the social unit. And this is a very important, very important point that sets up the basic frameworks by which possible relationships, alignments, and especially intermarriages might occur, so that the rules of exogamy characteristic of all societies can be generated and practiced within this matrix of defining how the Tsimshian moieties, I use the term phratry, this uses moiety means inside of those boxes are what are referenced as the phratries, and below each phratry level there is a sib level of membership. So on the one hand, the killer whale and the wolf comprise and are equivalent to the Haida raven moiety and the Tlingit wolf moiety. Now, there's a very subtle and important point that we can get to at the end of this. On the other side, we can see that the other two Tsimshian phratries represent a different kind of fusion in which eagle and raven are seen as being the equivalent of Haida eagle and Tlingit raven. Now, one of the subtleties in this is that in order for a Haida and Tlingit to observe the rule of exogamy as it should be, a Tlingit raven must marry a Haida raven, and a Tlingit wolf must marry a Haida wolf. You have to really subtly look at this framework and understand that. So these variations are a part of the underlying logic and principles which allowed the societies to come into social alignment around the principle of descent units. There are very fascinating case studies of cross-societal marriages that follow these kinds of principles, but these principles were never used to create what you might call alliances at a high level, which are used in other societies through marriage relationships. These, in fact, are used further on the northwest coast to the south by the Nuu-chah-nulth and the Kwakwakwa people. They do use marriage as a form of alliance creation. That is not a characteristic of the relationships that I have ever seen discussed amongst Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people. Social organization as descent units don't necessarily also implicate the nature of how that unit functions. These are all corporate descent groups and so operate in parallel fashion with regard to corporateness. Corporateness means that the descent unit is composed of the members by birth. All of the members then comprise are in the unit. The corporate kinship units are then the owners of various types of things. Those in turn operating as corporate ownership are under the trusteeship of the elite leaders of the group who make decisions about many of these kinds of corporate units jointly with their corporate group members. Property is very well established and as being held by these corporate units. Property rights, and property law are all well developed in each group, so that the recognition of rights is a fundamental conceptual matter that can be aligned again in terms of how the groups move. Property consists of resource locations, totemic crests and their representations, oral traditions, names, songs, dances, regalia, and other items. Property was owned by the descent unit and could not be used by members of other descent units unless they obtained authorizations from a unit leader. Violation of use results in the offended unit registering complaint, or worse, engaging in violence about the use. In the case of violation of natural resource territories, violence may occur. Let's turn now to the ceremonial practices through which the societies constituted themselves, reproduced themselves, and formally interacted. The principles of unilineal descent exogamy and corporate descent groups creates a structure of similarity. I use the term obligatory reciprocity, which means that in this, using these principles, you are obliged to deal with the opposites. You have no points of withdrawal. You must, in order to continue to exist, engage in reciprocal exchange. This is the driving force behind a system of continuous exchanges of services and resources between the unilineal corporate descent units. The most highlighted form in all three societies is what we will term, as a common term across all groups, the mortuary potlatch. Mortuary means in association with the death of a prominent figure, but it's characteristic of all levels of the society, and the subsequent treatment of the body and then later the ceremony related to the honoring of the passing of that particular person. That particular honoring ceremony, referred to as the mortuary potlatch, in Tlingit society is a critical part of an understanding of the cosmological and spiritual return of the individual. Their spirit must be freed for them to be able to return. The combination of cremation and the ceremonial release through the potlatch ritual makes possible the return and rebirth of that spirit in subsequent units. This particular matrix of belief is evident, but not so pronounced in the other two societies. The mortuary potlatch and event is the formal hosting of this event to which the related opposites are invited, particularly those that stand in direct reciprocal ties, but also others from the other side will be invited. As guests, they are honored, respected, and given gifts for the specific services that they have rendered. This particular form of ceremonialism is a pivotal form in all three societies that makes possible orderly, peaceful transitions of leadership, but also the orderly recognition of the claims of the unit, hosting unit, to their particular territories and properties. That is, the attendance at this event is in fact a judicial and legal proceeding as well, and that the attendees are recognizing and through their presence authorizing the claims of the hosts. This form of host-guest reciprocal event and feast is characteristic of many other social occasions in each society. So that as a ceremonial practice, this then can be understood and utilized in cross-societal, cross-cultural contexts. Underlying all the societies are a very broad range of shared cosmological and spiritual beliefs. They have similar underlying beliefs about Raven as a central player in transforming the circumstances of existence found in an earlier time through his various different events, those the conditions that we presently experience came into existence. In addition to the Raven cosmological cycle, there are also, which vary somewhat between the groups, there's also mythic charters or covenants that establish relations between human persons and the persons of other living forms. For one great example of this is what is called the Salmon Boy story, shared in very significant materials between the Tsimshian and the Tlingit, in a somewhat altered or less informed amongst the Haida. So these then establishing this underlying principle of the spirituality as persons of other living forms, as well as some non-living kinds of entities. Say trees, mountains, all of these entities have spirits and must be treated with respect and oriented to as persons in the way that human persons are oriented to in this society. In each society, shamans are powerful figures. They have special spiritual powers, which are acquired through extended exiles and key encounters with other spiritual forms to acquire specialized powers. Those powers then are in turn mobilized within their societal contexts. Typically, a shaman is associated with a particular house or clan group, but when they become well known for special kinds of powers, they may become called upon by other social units within their societies to provide services. Shaman services in all of these regards are recompensed. They are seen as powerful figures in curing ceremonies, in foreseeing future events. And in that particular capacity, their foreseeing capacity, they become of special importance in the context of conflict circumstances. Among the Tsimshian, descent unit leaders also acquire special spiritual powers that are known as Hale. This particular category of spiritual power found only amongst the Tsimshian elites was not found as such amongst Tlingit and Haida societies. Now, there is also an additional spiritualized form existing amongst the Tsimshian, the Ko-Tsimshian, whose late cultural development, it's difficult to determine if it was a pre-contact or a post-contact event arising out of stressful new circumstances. These were termed secret societies, and these secret societies were forms of spiritualized practice involving particular rites that only the elites, perhaps the elites that had Hale, participated in amongst the Ko-Tsimshian leadership. And this was a very, very critical part of the interaction of the incoming English missionary William Duncan in 1857 in his dealings with Ko-Tsimshian society that I'll mention briefly later on. There's some evidence that some of these spiritualized practices may have passed into Haida and Tlingit practice. For example, there is a recognized raven leader amongst the Hinya Tlingit who held what is called the dog eater spirit, which presumably was acquired by some relationship, perhaps through travels by his clan group to Fort Tsimshian for trading purposes, and brought back that spiritual power. And that spiritual power is recognized in a kutia in the Kloak Totem Park, as well as a story about its utilization in the book Wolf and Raven by Forrest and Garfield. Trade was an extraordinarily important feature of the relationships between the societies. This involved the movement of highly valued materials available from only certain locales or specially produced by certain groups in ancient times. Obsidian, copper, ochre, which is the red paint, red cedar, and other specialty materials. There also individuals became specialized producers. Trade was organized and conducted by kinship unit leaders acting on behalf of their groups and authorized to conduct trade. Women leaders exercised a very substantial control over final decisions in trade, as is clearly recognized in the literature of the maritime fur trade. In some cases, this appears to have involved partner-like agreements that extended the trading relationship over multiple generations and multiple occasions. This is, of course, an important way to ensure supply as well as a peaceful ongoing arrangement. Tsimshian oral traditions indicate that they obtained halibut resources, spruce roots, shellfish, and large canoes from the Haida, who would bring them to the Ko-Tsimshian region. Some of those, in turn, the Ko-Tsimshian traded upriver to their Gitskan neighbors as well as beyond. Haida in turn acquired terrestrial furs, the great Ulakan grease from the Nass River sites, and other products from the Tsimshian. The Tlingit traded large quantities of herring eggs and other specialty resources and copper to both groups, as well as later on in times, other materials. All of the groups had large canoes for distance traveling. Especially, this was a very important material that was created by the Haida because of the very large stands of red cedar on the islands from which the canoes could be made. And this particular depiction, this Haida canoe is 60 feet in length and 5 tons of capacity in terms of what it could carry, with 30 plus passengers. This is a depiction of that particular canoe carved on Haida Gwaii prior to 1883. It's in the collection of the American Museum of Natural History and continues to be there today in terms of its elegance and awesome proportions. This is at the mouth of the Nass River, a highly conflicted zone between the Nisga'a people who occupied the Nass River and the Tsimshians, who battled for control of sites for the production of ulucan grease. But this particular image displays the massive number of people who would come to the Nass River Trade Fair in the spring when the ulucan were running. The ulukans were ritually received by the Nisga'a and by the Tsimshian women, welcoming them to the area. That then became the basis for, as you can see on the right, the creation of the very, very valuable and important Nass River or ulucan grease, a product that is still to this day traded and valued in both Haida Gwaii and in southeastern Alaska. So a trade fair is a place where all of these kinds of interactions and social exchanges can occur, that can establish all kinds of agendas, calendars for events. So it is a multiplex. It's not merely for the exchange of ulucan grease for other materials, but for establishing and working out much broader principles of exchange relationships. One of the currencies were well established, and there were operating in all three societies what might be referred to as two spheres of exchange. There was the sphere of exchange of the domestic products, such as halibut, such as berries, such as most furs, and a sphere of exchange of luxury or elite products. And the currencies did not cross over, so that you could not purchase anything in the luxury or elite sphere with the domestic sphere materials. The currencies in the luxury or elite sphere primarily consisted of coppers, and in particular the form of the tina, or the copper, was a widely used currency. The Chilkat robe, or nachin, as depicted here, slaves, and I suspect, although it's not show up everywhere, that dentalium shells were also a currency. They were a currency, but they're not discussed much in the language. The dentalia being acquired from New Chalnuth groups on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and then traded through these interconnected networks all the way through southeast Alaska, up through the Chilkat traders or the Otna traders, far into the interior to the Gwich'in, who utilized those dentalia. This was an absolutely essential feature of the relationships between the groups. Ceremonial relations included, of course, this is an image of the kind of regalia that would be put on display, in this case by the Tlingit, as they are arriving at a memorial potlatch in historic times. Turning to the question of conflict and peace. Oral traditions recount various forms of conflict and violence within and between the ethnic groups. Reciprocal raiding between local units are reported for Tsimshian with Haida and Tlingit. Tlingits report raids with Tsimshian and Kaigani Haida populations, and Haida report raids on Tlingit and Haida communities and circumstances. These conflicts appear for the most part only to be carried out by local kinship or village units. My sense is that this kind of level of conflict became much more intense and current following the onset of the maritime fur trade, because of the importance of acquiring the goods that the Europeans and Americans brought, and the necessity of having the specific kinds of fur commodities required. Interestingly, accounts in both Tsimshian and Haida societies reference the appearance of a category that at least the Haidas in contemporary times refer to as pirates. That is, individuals who basically acted out of their own interests and utilized raiding as a major form of social provisioning rather than using the customary seasonal round and trading. It's very important to realize that the societies also shared a peacemaking system based on restoring balance by identifying and agreeing on losses and providing equivalent compensation. Through such procedures, they would restore the balance between themselves. However, there were large conflict as well, larger pitched conflicts over periods of time, which may be referred to as the Borderlands Wars, as these are primarily carried out in proximity to Dixon entrance. Tsimshian oral traditions recount substantial larger group warfare in the battle borderlands with Tlingit groups on the eastern side of Dixon entrance, and ultimately, subsequently, resulting in the configuration of the landscape that is now recognized as being at contact. Some of this was accomplished by Tlingit movements to the north. Tlingit oral traditions indicate that Tsimshians were stopped in a battle in which the Tlingits prevailed, and through which they acquired the powerful name of the Stikine leader Shakes. This is another very interesting principle of trans-societal relationship, the ability to acquire crests and powers and things across the societal line through established procedures. You can't just go out and take it. There has to be an established procedure. On the other side of the Dixon entrance from Haida Gwaii, Haida oral traditions we recount movement north into the southeastern Prince of Wales archipelago on several occasions, mostly accomplished as local units, and in several cases resulting in violent confrontations. Subsequently, the Tlingit groups previously occupying the region, now occupied by Kaigani Haini, moved eastward to become the Tantaquan. In a very interesting, but it's the only isolated account that I've ever seen of this occurrence, there is a discussion that at the village of Sukwon, which was occupied by the Tlingit, the Tekwedi clan primary occupant, because it has a bear crest associated with it, and that name was subsequently retained by the Kaigani Haida after occupancy. The oral tradition suggests that for a period of time, it was occupied by both the Tlingits and the Haidas. In other words, there was not a violent displacement in that particular case, but that over time, whatever forms of disagreement developed, or other kinds of which are not recounted, the Tlingits eventually left and joined the Tantaquan in the southern part on the east mainland shore. So it's a fascinating. There are also other kinds of group movements as well. Kinship similarities make it possible for movement between groups. There are stories of kin units as units crossing ethnic and geographic borders and assimilating into another society. Swanton recounts a Haida lineage, whose name I did not go back and trace, moving into the Stikine region and becoming a clan group assimilating into Tlingit society. A Tsimshian group migrated to the east side of Graham Island in Haida and assimilated into Haida society. And it appears that there's a Tlingit group which moved into the Coast Tsimshian region and became one of the recognized 9 tribes. Now, this is a fascinating phenomena in terms of the ability to assimilate and move across the societal boundaries and take up a new social identity in this new location. Principles of ancestry was still understood. People knew through their oral traditions where they came from and who they were before the circumstances of their movement. There are accounts of individual intermarriage that occur, but these do not appear to be common and are not features of organized alliance or partnership agreements. The spiritualized pragmatics of shamanism, by which I refer to the fact that shamans, as an important individuals in the society who protect, are especially important in protecting landscapes of the villages. Shaman burials continue to be regarded as sites of spiritual power and communication that contemporary members of the societies avoid. Amongst the Hinya Tlingit, shaman burials were positioned at a distance from winter villages and locations with sight lines oriented to the region where enemies might appear. That powerful resonance permeating out from those sites are, in fact, to give evidence to potential evident enemies of the spiritual power present. And they can also be communicated with as sources of intelligence by living shamans, with the shamans buried in those locations. In addition, the Kaigani and Northern Haida similarly positioned their shaman burials away from village in the direction of potential enemy incursions. In the Tsimshian region, Coast Tsimshian region archaeologist Andrew Martindale says that he has identified a similar patterning of Coast Tsimshian shaman burials. So let's turn now to talk a little bit about what happened at Contact and beyond. I want to touch on, of course, and only in passing, some significant dimensions of what has come down in the historical records. The explorers came earlier to the Tlingit and Haida because of their outer coastal presence, and somewhat later into the Tsimshian waters. However, for all 3 groups, the maritime fur trade for sea otters got underway in 1786. And this led to massive changes for all 3 of these societies, as it implicated various factors in terms of the increase in provisioning of wealth and the dependency on new forms of material goods from the Western traders. This, as I indicated earlier, is likely a stimulus to greater conflict amongst the groups. A real critical establishment was, for all the groups, was the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Simpson in 1828. Prior and subsequent to that time, the Hudson Bay Company also operated steamers to go up into southeastern Alaska and out to the Queen Charlottes to trade. They had certain treaty rights in southeastern Alaska, and they appeared at a number of locations. Coast Tsimshians became crew members on those vessels and thereby acquired knowledge about various different locations in the region and how to go about getting there on their own. We also see amongst the Coast Tsimshian the emergence of Lagai as the paramount Coast Tsimshian chief, arguably over all of the tribes which before exercised equivalent political status through their leaders. He largely gained a monopoly on the trade with the Gitskan. All 3 groups were hit substantially hard by the smallpox and suffered population declines, which are a critical feature in reconstituting the populations. And it's in that aftermath, I would suspect that when William Duncan, the missionary, arrived in Fort Simpson in 1857, he began a very systematic encounter with the culture and language, and eventually decided that along with the Tsimshian converts, to establish the model village known as Metlakatla, which was a previously occupied village that people moved to Fort Simpson. He did this with the assistance of the remarkable figure known as Claw, who later became Wellington Claw. Duncan created a communal model of enterprise with log lumbering practices, sawmills, vessel building, and subsequent salmon processing that was modeled throughout the Northwest Coast region and into southeastern Alaska. One of the Claw eventually became his own independent trading individual. And this is a volume, I hope you can see it, that is about his life as a trader and in his role in relationship with William Duncan. Finally, in 1887, in purpose of our present discussion, there was the Tsimshian movement in association with William Duncan of 900 people to Annette Island in 1887, which subsequently became the reserve, the Tsimshian Reserve, through federal legislation in 1915 with a 3,000-foot water reservation boundary that I don't have time to talk about now, but is very significant in the subsequent history. And so that ends my discussion, and I'd be happy to take inquiries along any of the materials that I've been discussing.
Thank you, Dr. Langdon. Yes, as you said, we will now take questions. If people have questions, please submit them through the chat function in YouTube. We have a question here from a Haida person. Could you speak about the Chinook jargon trade language and its role in intertribal relations?
That's an excellent question, Chuck. Wonderful question. Yes, indeed. This is a very, very significant part of the fur trade period, in which all of the Northwest Coast groups became, and it also points to another, is the multilinguality amongst all the populations around in the borderlands region especially, but extending further north as well. But the Chinook jargon as a trade jargon grew up particularly in order to facilitate trade with the Europeans and the Euro-Americans. And its foundational elements, as I recall, seem to be from terms coming from the Nutchal Nuth. But there are things like, for example, the term chuck, which references a whirlpool, a very strong whirlpool. That's a term from Chinook jargon that entered in and became utilized. There are also, I'm trying to remember what other terms came into common usage as a result of the utilization of Chinook jargon. It's a very good question, and it persisted probably until the latter part of the 19th century, but it fell out of utilization once the maritime fur trade and then other forms of political and social organization took over. Very good question. Thank you for bringing that into the discussion.
Another question we have is, were there centers of commerce or of wealth in wealth development in Haida country, like there was in like there were in the Tsimshian country, and then similar to like Sitka and Wrangell and Klukwan in Alaska?
Well, which came to be the two primary in the aftermath of the fur trade, to an extent, what happened in Haida Gwaii was they became kind of an outlier in terms of the whole system, largely due to the disappearance of the sea otter. They had a high prominence and acquired guns and became very, very substantial long distance traders and slave raiders down into Puget Sound. And in the period following the onset of the maritime fur trade. But the decline of the sea otters gradually diminished their role in the fur trade, so they had to shift to other kinds of means. What's really significant is what happened in Haida is that the decimation by smallpox, over 90% of the population declined, so that the residual, all of the wonderful villages in the outlying regions, essentially as is well known amongst Haida people, came to be consolidated in the two villages of Skidegate and Masset. And Masset certainly is a location of enormous, and both villages are from the evidence of the building of the totem poles in each area. Those forms of cultural wealth were manifest, and certainly their trading abilities brought in large amounts of wealth that were distributed through the ceremonial practices as well. But the prominence of the Tsimshian Lagai and the Chilkat Kachlach are because that grows up in the time period in which it shifts to a terrestrial fur trade. So the control of the interior and access to the Dene and other interior groups in acquiring their furs for trade to the Europeans and Americans is what's fueled the great rich and wealth generation that occurs at Klukwan and amongst the Tsimshians.
Wow, thank you very much. This has been a very edifying and learned discussion. We have a lot of comments of appreciation from as far away as Kitscan territory and in Alaska and other areas among Haida and Tsimshian and Tlingit people. So thank you very much. We have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and also allow our funders to measure the impact of the program. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. I would like to announce another lecture series in March entitled Alaska Native Subsistence. Please join us on Tuesdays and Thursdays during March for an outstanding selection of speakers. We start off the series with a premiere showing of the film entitled Sitka Herring Egg Subsistence Harvest at noon on March the 2nd. These lectures are not focused just on Southeast, but cover statewide issues of concern to Native peoples. So we invite you to view and join us in those series. Thank you very much.